Jack had always felt more at home in the wilderness than anywhere else. He had spent years navigating the dense forests, living off the land, and studying the intricate balance of nature. As a seasoned outdoorsman and a devoted wildlife conservationist, he knew every inch of these woods, every whisper of the wind, and every shifting shadow between the trees. He could tell a bear had passed through an area just by the faint disturbance of leaves, predict an incoming storm simply by the scent of the air, and recognize the subtle changes in animal behavior that signaled danger or unrest. On this particular morning, Jack set off for his usual patrol with the ease of a man who had walked this path 1,000 times before. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and the calls of distant birds layered the forest in a familiar, comforting symphony. The soft crunch of his boots against the underbrush was the only human sound in an otherwise untouched wilderness. But something felt off. The forest was never truly silent, but as Jack moved deeper, he noticed a strange stillness in the air. Birds that should have been chirping had gone quiet. The usual rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth was absent. His instincts prickled. A lifetime of experience had taught him that the woods spoke in their own way, and right now, they were holding their breath. Then he heard it. A sound unlike anything he had encountered before. Low, pained, and filled with an eerie desperation. It wasn't the cry of a common forest animal. It wasn't the snarl of a wounded predator. It was something in between, something unfamiliar. Jack froze, his pulse quickening. His senses sharpened as he strained to listen. The cry came again, a haunting wail drifting through the trees. It was deeper in the forest, beyond his usual patrol route. His mind raced through possibilities. A trapped animal, an injured predator, or something else entirely. Jack adjusted his gear, tightening his grip on his rifle. Not out of fear, but out of habit. He wasn't one to shy away from the unknown. If something in his forest was in trouble, it was his responsibility to investigate. He moved swiftly yet cautiously, weaving between towering trees, his footsteps light against the forest floor. The closer he got, the louder the sound became. It was guttural now, almost human, but not quite, laced with pain and urgency. The air grew thick with an unexplainable tension. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Then in a small clearing just ahead, he saw movement. Jack's breath hitched as he stepped forward, his heart pounding. Whatever lay beyond the thick brush, it was waiting for him. And he was about to find out what it was. Jack followed the sound, his every step measured, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. The cries grew sharper, raw with agony and fear, until finally, through the thick brush, he spotted the source. A massive black bear. It lay in the middle of a clearing, half collapsed, its great body trembling with pain. Jack's stomach tightened as he took in the scene. The bear's front paw was trapped in a rusted steel contraption, its jagged metal jaws sunk deep into flesh. Blood darkened the ground beneath it. The bear's powerful chest heaved with each ragged breath, and though it still had strength left, it was weakening fast. Jack felt a surge of anger. Poachers. There were strict laws against traps like these, but some people didn't care. They set them anyway, leaving animals to suffer in agony, sometimes for days. He clenched his jaw. He had seen death in the wild before, predators hunting prey, the natural cycle of life. But this was cruelty. The bear let out another deep, mournful cry, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. He needed to focus. His instincts screamed caution. A wounded, terrified bear was one of the most dangerous creatures in the wild. It wasn't just the sheer power of the beast, though one swipe of those claws could rip a man apart, but the unpredictability. Fear and pain made animals desperate. Even a creature that recognized him as no threat could lash out if panic took hold. Jack moved slowly, deliberately, his hands relaxed at his sides. The bear's dark eyes flicked to him, wide with pain but strangely aware. It wasn't blind with rage, nor did it immediately growl or lunge. Instead, it let out a low, huffing sound, half warning, half plea. Jack had a choice. He could back away and report the trap, It would be the safest option. Park rangers could come, tranquilize the bear, and free it without risk. But the thought of leaving it there, alone and suffering, didn't sit right with him. The bear might not have that long. Infection, exhaustion, or another predator could claim it before help arrived. Jack knew what he had to do. Keeping his voice low and steady, he spoke. "Easy now, big guy," he murmured, inching closer. "I know it hurts. Just hold on." The bear flinched, but didn't pull away. That was a good sign. Jack knew from experience that tone mattered as much as body language. Animals could sense intent. He had no weapon drawn, no sudden movements. He was just a presence, not a threat. Step by step, he moved closer, watching the bear's every breath. The trap was an old, brutal thing, the kind designed to hold an animal indefinitely. The more the bear struggled, the deeper the jagged edges cut. Jack knelt beside it, close enough now to see the torn flesh, the way blood oozed with every twitch. He set his gear down quietly, his hands steady despite the tension coiling in his muscles. He had to do this fast. Gripping the rusted metal, he braced himself and pulled. The bear roared, thrashing, its immense body jerking as pain shot through it. Jack nearly lost his balance but held firm. I know, he said quickly, his heart hammering. "I need you to trust me." The bear huffed, panting hard, but it didn't snap at him. That alone felt like a miracle. Jack gritted his teeth and pulled again. The trap didn't budge. It had been clamped shut for too long. Rust and dried blood had fused parts of it together. He needed more leverage. Sliding one boot against the ground for support, he adjusted his grip and threw his strength into it. The metal groaned, and suddenly, with a sharp creak, it gave way. The bear let out a deep, guttural grunt as its paw slipped free. Jack barely had time to react before the massive creature lurched up, staggering back. He scrambled away instinctively, half expecting it to turn on him. But it didn't. The bear stood there, trembling. Its injured paw lifted slightly off the ground. Blood dripped into the dirt, but it was free. It could heal. It could live. Jack held his breath, watching, waiting. Then, the bear lifted its head and looked at him. Not a glance of fear or threat, but something deeper. A moment of silent understanding. For several long seconds, neither moved. Then slowly the bear turned and limped away, disappearing into the dense trees. Jack exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had spent his life in the wilderness, but moments like these, when the untamed world acknowledged him, not as an intruder, but as something else, were rare. He stayed there for a moment longer, listening to the forest return to life around him. The birds, once silent, had begun to sing again. The wind whispered through the trees. The world had shifted back into balance. Jack gathered his things and rose to his feet. His work here wasn't done. He still had to track down the person who had set that trap. But for now, he allowed himself one last glance toward the trees where the bear had vanished, feeling a quiet, unspoken connection lingering in the air. Then, with a final deep breath, he turned and walked away. For days after freeing the bear, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. He had spent too many years in the wilderness to mistake the weight of an unseen gaze. Something lingered at the edges of his awareness, a presence just beyond his line of sight. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the mind. The forest was full of movement after all. The rustling of leaves, the scampering of small creatures, the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. These were all sounds he had learned to interpret, cataloging them into familiar patterns. But this was different. A shadow in his periphery, a branch bending where no wind blew, the silence that fell whenever he stopped walking, as if something or someone was holding its breath just beyond reach. Jack wasn't afraid. He had faced far worse in the wild, but he was curious. Then, on the third evening after the rescue, he saw it. As he knelt by a creek refilling his canteen, he caught the faintest shift of movement across the water. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head, and there it was, the bear, It stood among the trees, partially obscured by the undergrowth, its dark eyes locked onto him. Jack froze, his grip tightening around his canteen. The bear made no sound, no move toward him. It was just watching. Jack exhaled slowly, keeping his movements measured. He had seen animals observe humans before, but this was different. The bear wasn't fearful, nor was it aggressive. It wasn't even particularly cautious. It was as if it had been waiting for him to notice. Jack stayed where he was, meeting the bear's gaze across the water. Minutes passed, stretched thin by the tension in the air. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, the bear turned and melted back into the trees. Jack remained crouched by the creek long after it was gone, his mind racing. The encounter didn't unsettle him. It fascinated him. Wild animals didn't usually behave this way. A bear, once freed from a trap, should have disappeared into the depths of the forest, avoiding human contact at all costs. And yet this one had stayed. Why? The question nagged at him over the following days. He resumed his patrols, maintaining his usual routines, but now he was more aware, listening for that familiar rustle, watching for the flicker of dark fur against the green and brown of the forest. And soon he confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The bear was following him, never too close, never intruding, but always there, lingering at the edge of his world. It would appear just long enough for him to catch a glimpse before disappearing again, a silent, watchful shadow. Jack didn't try to approach it. He knew better. Trust in the wild was something that could never be forced. It had to be earned. So instead, he left an offering. One morning at the edge of a clearing near his cabin, he placed a small bundle of food, fresh fish, berries, and a chunk of dried venison. Then he stepped away, retreating just far enough to watch from a distance. He waited. For hours, nothing happened. But just as he was about to head inside, a familiar shape emerged from the trees. The bear moved slowly, cautiously. It sniffed the air, its eyes flicking toward where Jack stood. For a moment, it hesitated. Then, with deliberate care, it stepped forward and took the food. Jack exhaled, a slow smile tugging at his lips. Over the next several weeks, this strange dance continued. The bear's presence became a constant, and Jack began to anticipate its quiet appearances. Sometimes it simply watched from a distance. Other times, it drew closer, standing just within the boundaries of Jack's world. And each time Jack left an offering, the bear accepted, its wariness gradually fading. One evening, as Jack sat outside by the fire, he spoke aloud, his voice low and steady. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" he mused, watching as the bear settled a short distance away, half hidden by the trees. It huffed softly, tilting its massive head. Jack chuckled. "Yeah, I get it. You don't trust easily." He stared into the fire for a moment before continuing. "Can't blame you. The world's not exactly kind." He wasn't sure why he talked to the bear. Maybe it was because out here, words were often meaningless, and yet they still carried weight. Maybe it was because in some strange way, the bear had become a presence in his life that felt different from the others. The bear wouldn't understand his words, but it understood something deeper. It didn't leave, and that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and what had begun as wary observation transformed into something Jack couldn't quite define. The bear no longer hid. It moved with an ease that suggested familiarity, as if it had chosen to acknowledge him not as a threat, but as something else. Jack didn't push the boundaries. He never tried to touch it, never moved too fast, never crossed the invisible line that still existed between them. But that line was thinner now, blurred by time and quiet understanding. One afternoon, as he sat on a fallen log cleaning his knife, the bear approached closer than ever before. It paused just a few feet away, watching him with dark, intelligent eyes. Jack met its gaze, feeling a strange sense of recognition pass between them. No fear, no hostility, just trust. Jack smiled. "Guess we're not so different after all, huh?" The bear huffed softly, then turned and disappeared into the trees once more. But Jack knew it would return, because some bonds once formed never truly fade. Jack had spent his life in the wilderness, but the sight before him filled him with dread. Scattered across the forest floor, hidden beneath leaves and moss, were steel traps. New, rusted things designed to clamp down and never let go. His jaw tightened as he knelt beside one, carefully brushing away the dirt. It was the same type of brutal contraption that had nearly crippled the bear. His bear. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This was no accident. Someone was setting these deliberately, and not just one or two. There were dozens, placed strategically along game trails. Poachers. Jack's hands clenched into fists. He had hoped that after finding and dismantling the last trap, that had been the end of it. But this was worse. The poachers weren't just passing through. They were hunting in his woods, and his bear was in danger. Jack wasted no time. He moved with purpose, dismantling the traps one by one, careful not to set them off. He marked each location, memorizing the pattern. These weren't randomly placed. They were calculated, meant to trap larger animals, likely for illegal sale. The thought made his blood boil. The bear had trusted him, had come to see him as something other than a threat. Now Jack would return the favor. Tracking humans was different from tracking animals, but Jack was no stranger to the task. The careless boot prints, cigarette butts crushed into the dirt, the faint scent of gasoline lingering in the wind. All signs led him toward the men responsible. For days, he followed their movements. They were sloppy, arrogant, leaving traces of their presence like stains on the land. And then, one afternoon, deep in the heart of the forest, he found them. Two men. They were setting another trap near a narrow ravine, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. One of them was laughing, the other kneeling as he worked the metal jaws apart. Jack's heart pounded. He could take them by surprise, but they were armed. One wrong move and the situation could turn deadly. He took a slow breath, considering his options. Then the forest went silent. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the trees. Jack froze. The poachers stiffened. The man kneeling by the trap turned his head just in time to see a massive shadow move through the underbrush. The bear. It stepped forward, its black fur bristling, its deep-set eyes locked onto the men. The air grew thick with tension. The poachers barely had time to react before the bear let out a roar, deafening, primal, shaking the very ground beneath them. Panic. The men scrambled backward, their rifles forgotten in the moment of sheer terror. One of them cursed under his breath, fumbling for his weapon, but his hands were shaking too much to get a grip. Jack didn't hesitate. He moved like the wilderness had taught him, quick, precise, deliberate. Before the poachers could regain their composure, he grabbed a thick branch and struck the rifle out of one man's grasp. It clattered against the rocks. The second man turned, eyes wild with fear, but the bear stepped forward again, its massive body blocking any path of escape. They were trapped. Jack knew this land better than anyone. The poachers had set their traps near the ravine, a mistake they would now regret. He maneuvered swiftly, forcing them to stumble back toward the ledge. One misstep, and they would find themselves with no way out. The bear growled again, lower this time, almost calculated, as if it knew exactly what Jack was doing. The poachers hesitated, their breath ragged. "Call it off," one of them barked, but Jack didn't flinch. "This is his forest," he said simply. "Not yours." The men barely had time to process his words before the sound of distant sirens broke through the trees. Jack's signal had worked. Within moments, the authorities arrived, rifles raised, voices cutting through the tension. The poachers didn't resist. They knew the fight was over. As the men were dragged away, Jack turned back toward the bear. It stood there, still watching, still waiting. The rage that had burned in its eyes only moments ago had softened, replaced by something else. Recognition. Jack swallowed hard, realizing what had just happened. The bear hadn't just scared the poachers, It hadn't just defended its territory, it had protected him. They stood in silence, man and beast, bound by something deeper than words. Jack exhaled. Guess we're even now. The bear huffed, then, without another sound, turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the wilderness where it belonged. Jack watched it go, a quiet respect settling over him. He had always known the forest had its own rules, its own unspoken laws. But today, he had learned something new. Some bonds, no matter how wild, could never truly be broken. And some protectors walked on four legs. One day Jack had smelled smoke before, campfires, burning brush, the occasional lightning strike that left a scar on the earth. But this was different. This was thick, acrid, and wrong. He paused mid-stride, inhaling deeply. The wind carried a scent of charred wood, dry leaves, and something else. Something ominous. He turned his head toward the horizon and saw it. A thick column of smoke rising above the treetops. His gut twisted, a wildfire, and it was spreading fast. Jack didn't hesitate. He took off through the woods, his boots pounding against the dry earth. The air was growing hotter by the second, an unnatural heat that carried the crackling whispers of flames dancing hungrily across the forest floor. Panic surged through him, not for himself, but for the creatures that called this place home. He had spent years protecting these woods, watching over the delicate balance of life within them. And now, it was all in danger. But one thought rose above the rest, tightening around his chest like a vice. The bear. Jack pushed forward, weaving between trees, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of his silent companion. The flames were creeping closer, licking at the undergrowth, feeding off the brittle remains of a long, dry summer. Then, through the thickening smoke, he saw movement. A massive shadow lumbered between the trees, its dark fur illuminated by the glow of fire. The bear. But something was wrong. It was moving erratically, its massive head swinging from side to side, nostrils flaring. Jack realized the truth in an instant. The bear was disoriented, overwhelmed by the smoke and the chaos of the fire. It wasn't running away from danger, it was moving toward it. Jack's heart pounded. If it kept going that way, it would be trapped. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, his voice hoarse against the thick air. "Hey, this way!" The bear froze, turning its head toward him. Its eyes, usually sharp and knowing, were clouded with confusion. It let out a deep huff, hesitating. The fire crackled louder, and the sky above turned a choking shade of orange. Jack took a step forward. "Come on, big guy. You need to trust me." For a split second, the bear didn't move. It could bolt. It could vanish into the flames, lost forever. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, it took a step toward him. Jack exhaled sharply. Through the suffocating heat and the falling embers, he began to move, guiding the bear step by step away from the inferno. He stayed just ahead, glancing back every few seconds to make sure it was still following. At first, the bear hesitated, its instincts warring with its trust in him. But then, as if making a decision deeper than reason, it moved with purpose, following his lead without question. They wove through the trees, past smoldering underbrush and branches collapsing under the weight of the heat. Jack's lungs burned, his skin damp with sweat, but he didn't stop. The bear was right behind him now, close enough that he could hear its heavy breathing, feel the warmth of its massive body through the smoke-filled air. Jack's vision blurred as he stumbled forward, his legs screaming in protest. His body begged for rest, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Then, through the haze, he saw it. A break in the trees. A clearing. With the last of his strength, he pushed forward, his boots skidding against the dirt as he stumbled into the open air. The bear followed, emerging from the smoke like something out of a legend, its black fur streaked with ash. Jack collapsed to his knees, coughing violently, his throat raw from the smoke. But they had made it. They were safe. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night. Firefighters were coming, their silhouettes appearing through the shifting orange glow. The fire would be contained, The forest would heal. Jack lifted his head, his vision swimming, and there, standing just a few feet away, was the bear. It wasn't leaving. Not yet. It stood tall, its dark eyes locked onto him, its massive body still rising and falling with each breath. Jack knew it should have run. Wild animals didn't linger once they were safe. And yet, here it was, waiting for him. He swallowed hard, his throat aching. "Guess that makes us even again, huh?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The bear huffed, a low, familiar sound. Then, with one last lingering glance, it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving only its tracks in the ash-dusted earth. Jack sat there for a long time, watching the place where it had vanished. This wasn't just survival anymore. This wasn't just a moment of luck. Something had changed. The bond between them was no longer about fear, no longer about necessity. It was something deeper, something rare, something that would never fade. And as the firefighters arrived, shouting his name, Jack knew one thing for certain. The bear would return. Because in the heart of the wild, some connections were never meant to be broken. The forest had changed since the fire. Though the worst had passed, the scars remained. Charred trees standing like blackened skeletons, the once vibrant undergrowth reduced to patches of smoldered earth. But even amidst the destruction, life endured. Tiny green shoots pushed stubbornly through the ash. Birds returned to sing once more, and the scent of new beginnings mixed with the lingering traces of smoke. And the bear was still here. Jack had seen it many times in the weeks following the fire. It had stayed close, watching him as it always had. It had not approached, nor had it vanished into the depths of the wilderness. Instead, it had lingered, as if waiting for something. But today was different. Jack stood at the edge of a clearing, his hands resting on his belt, watching as the bear moved through the trees with slow, deliberate steps. This time, it wasn't circling back. It wasn't pausing to glance his way. It was going farther than ever before, heading toward the untouched depths of the wild, where no man had ever set foot. Jack's chest tightened, but he didn't move. He had always known this day would come. The bear had never truly belonged to him, nor had he belonged to it. They had simply shared a moment in time. Two beings crossing paths, forging an unspoken connection in the vastness of nature. Calling out would be selfish, and Jack wasn't selfish, so he stayed silent, watching as the bear, his bear, disappeared into the shadows of the trees. And just like that, it was gone. Jack remained still for a long time, staring at the place where the bear had vanished. A part of him felt hollow, like he had lost something irreplaceable. But another part of him knew this was right. This was the way things were meant to be. The bear had given him something few ever received, a glimpse into the wild in its purest form. A bond built not on control or ownership, but on mutual respect, trust, and survival. And now it was time for him to give something back. That evening, Jack sat by the fire outside his cabin, staring into the flickering flames. His mind was restless, thoughts swirling like embers in the wind. The forest was healing, but it wasn't just fire that threatened it. Poachers, deforestation, the slow, creeping destruction of human greed. He thought about the traps, about the men who had nearly stolen the bear's future. He thought about the fire, about the wildlife that had barely survived, about the battle still left to fight. And he made a decision. Jack had always been a protector of the wild, but now he would be more. In the months that followed, Jack dedicated himself fully to the fight for conservation. He forged alliances with rangers, environmentalists, and lawmakers, determined to make real change. He spent weeks tracking illegal poaching rings, exposing their operations, and ensuring justice was served. He spoke at town meetings, educating communities about the delicate balance of nature and the importance of coexistence. He worked to strengthen anti-poaching laws, making sure no animal would suffer the way the bear almost had. But more than anything, he told his story. The story of a man and a bear, of a trust forged in the depths of the wild, of a bond that defied fear and instinct. His tale spread farther than he ever imagined, reaching conservationists around the world, inspiring others to take action. People who had never cared about the wilderness before suddenly found themselves moved by the idea that nature wasn't just something to be observed, it was something to be protected. The bear became a symbol, not of domestication, not of taming the wild, but of respect, of trust, of the rare fleeting moments when two worlds collided, not as enemies, but as equals. Years passed, and Jack never saw the bear again. But sometimes, when he stood on his porch at dusk, he swore he could feel its presence, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, acknowledging. And he would smile, knowing that somewhere, deep in the heart of the untamed wild, his old companion still roamed free, exactly as it was always meant to be. And so would Jack. For as long as the forest stood, so would his promise to protect it. Because some bonds, even when unseen, never truly fade. They become legends, they become legacies, and they live on, forever, in the whispers of the wild. Time was a quiet thief. Decades had passed since Jack first stepped into these woods as a young man, his heart wild with the untamed rhythm of the wilderness. The forest had shaped him, tested him, and in the end, made him a part of its story. He had spent his life as its guardian, watching over the land, protecting the creatures that called it home. His reputation had grown beyond the trees, reaching conservation circles and policy meetings, where his voice, once just the musings of a lone man in the wild, now carried weight. Laws had changed because of him. Traps had been outlawed, poachers driven away. But none of that mattered as much as the feeling he had when he walked through the woods each day. Even now, as his hair had turned silver and the lines of age traced his weathered face, Jack's routine remained the same. His steps were slower, but his eyes still missed nothing. Every whisper of the wind, every shift in the undergrowth, every distant bird call, he read them like poetry, like an old language he had spent a lifetime mastering. And always, in the back of his mind, he thought of the bear. It had been years since their last encounter. Years since the fire, since they had stood together in the clearing, smoke curling in the sky, their fates intertwined in a moment neither could fully understand. After that day, the bear had disappeared back into the depths of the forest. Jack had never seen it again, but he had never stopped looking. It was a crisp autumn morning when it happened. Jack had been walking along an old patrol route, his boots pressing gently into the damp earth, when something caught his eye. A disturbance in the soil, not the careless scuffing of a human, nor the swift marks of a passing deer. Something bigger. Jack stopped. Slowly he crouched, running his fingers along the edges of the indentations. The shape was unmistakable, broad, heavy, powerful. He pressed his palm into the print, feeling the weight of years settle over him like a warm embrace. Bear tracks. His breath hitched, and for the first time in years his heart pounded with that old familiar thrill. It was still out there. He glanced up, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those dark eyes watching him once more. But the forest remained still, the towering trees swaying gently in the wind. Jack smiled. It didn't need to be here for him to know the truth. The bear had survived, thrived, and that was enough. Jack rose slowly, his knees aching with the weight of time, but his heart felt light. This was what it had always been about. Not just the bear, not just his bear, but all of them. Every creature that roamed the wild without fear, every patch of land untouched by greed, every breath of air untainted by destruction. His life's work was never about changing the world. It was about protecting the parts of it that were never meant to be tamed. Jack turned one last time, letting his gaze linger on the tracks before stepping forward, following his own path back into the forest. He didn't need to see the bear again to know it was watching over him, just as he had once watched over it. Their story, once personal, now belonged to the land. a testament to the connection between man and nature, a promise that some bonds, no matter how wild, never fade. And as long as the forest stood, so too would their legacy. One act of kindness. That was all it took to change everything. Jack hadn't known it at the time. When he knelt beside the wounded bear, prying open the rusted steel trap with his bare hands, he wasn't thinking about the years that would follow. He wasn't thinking about the bond that would form, the silent companionship, the unspoken understanding. All he knew was that an animal, strong, powerful, and proud, was suffering, and he could do something about it. True bravery, he had learned, wasn't about facing the elements or surviving the wilderness. It wasn't about standing your ground against a predator or tracking poachers through the dark. It was about choosing to protect something that couldn't protect itself, even when it was dangerous, even when no one was watching. And that choice had led him here. Jack had never spoken the bear's name aloud, not because he hadn't given it one, but because naming something felt like ownership. And the bear was not his to claim. Yet somehow, in ways beyond words, they had understood each other. The way the bear had watched him from the shadows after the rescue, the way it had followed, cautious but curious, the way it had trusted him, moving through fire and smoke, believing in his guidance when instinct should have told it to run. That was what people failed to understand. Animals were not mindless creatures driven only by hunger and fear. They could feel, learn, trust. And Jack had spent his life teaching others to see them that way. Because conservation wasn't just about policies or laws. It wasn't just about stopping poachers or protecting land. It was about changing the way people saw the world around them. And sometimes it started with a single story. Jack had spent years battling against those who saw the forest as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. He had walked the same trails, pulled the same illegal traps from the earth, driven the same men away time and time again. It was exhausting, but it was worth it, because every moment of effort meant another creature spared from suffering, another stretch of land left untouched, another chance for the wild to remain as it was meant to be, untamed, free. Not everyone could dedicate their life to the fight, but everyone could do something, because the wild didn't belong to corporations. It didn't belong to hunters or poachers or even to those who fought to protect it. It belonged to itself and to the creatures within it. Jack had spent years watching the bear's tracks fade into the wilderness. He had followed its trail, knowing it was still out there, knowing it had survived. But he had never called it back, because the greatest act of love wasn't holding on. It was letting go. The bear had always belonged to the wild, and Jack had always known that in the end that was where it had to stay. Still, sometimes, when the wind was just right, when the rustling of the trees sounded like something more, he could almost feel its presence again. Watching. A reminder that some connections never truly break, that kindness, once given, never really fades, and that the wild, in all its untamed beauty, had given him something he could never lose, a part of itself. Would you have done the same as Jack? Would you have stepped forward, faced the danger, and taken the risk to save a wild creature? Jack never hesitated. When he saw the bear trapped, its massive body trembling in pain, its dark eyes filled with confusion, yet pleading for help, he acted without a second thought. No fear, no calculation, just instinct and compassion. But how many of us would have turned away, walked past, left the bear to its fate? The truth is, protecting nature is never easy. It is not safe, it is not convenient, and it does not always come with rewards. But it is always necessary. Every choice we make, to ignore or to intervene, determines the future of the creatures we share this planet with. Jack's story is proof that a single act of kindness can change a life, perhaps even more than one. Jack never sought recognition. He didn't need awards, news articles, or speeches to validate his work. He never wanted to be a hero, but the forest remembered. The land he fought for still stood, The creatures he protected still roamed free. And somewhere, deep in the wilderness, a bear, his bear, still walked, alive because of one moment of compassion. That was his legacy, not wealth, not fame, but a life dedicated to something greater than himself. His story is not just about a man and a bear. It is about respect, about understanding, about seeing nature not as something to be controlled, but as something to be honored. Because the wild is not a thing to be conquered. It is a world to be safeguarded, and the responsibility belongs to all of us. Jack's time in the forest eventually came to an end. The years passed and his presence faded like footprints washed away by the wind and time. But the lesson remains. Nature does not belong to us. It is not something to be dominated or owned. It is something to protect. The only question is, will we?